Welcome to From Stardust to Us, in-depth conversations with thought leaders, artists, and spiritual activists, navigating the challenges of our times with integrity, joy, and purpose. I'm Bernice Marie Daly.
And I'm Linnell Hayden. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate our listeners. You can find us on YouTube, Buzzsprout, or any place where podcasts are found. If you enjoy our conversation, please help us reach more people by subscribing, liking, and commenting. So let's get into this week's conversation.
Welcome, Brian Muldoon. Very happy to be with you today. I'm going to give our audience a little peek into your life and what brought you here to us today. Brian was raised in a large Irish Catholic family, was attracted to religious life as a youngster. Although he did veer toward marriage and law school, he never entirely lost his dream and his desire to be a monk who lived fully in the world. Years into his legal practice, he took a year-long sabbatical and honed his legal skills away from profits and into the co-founding of one of the first mediation firms in the United States in Chicago in about 1985. And so for the next 25 years, he helped settle thousands of lawsuits. And in 1996, he published his first book, The Heart of Conflict, which has been used in graduate seminars and military training and corporate leadership programs. And Brian has been interviewed on Good Morning America, PBS, and numerous other outlets. In the midst of all that, in 1993, Brian's life was upended when he was asked to head the facilitation team for the Parliament of World Religions, which was attended by leaders of virtually every denomination on earth, plus 6,000 of their followers. In the aftermath of that, Brian became the executive director of Chicago's Metropolitan Interfaith Initiative. And in the course of this work, Brian became a close friend of the Catholic monk, Brother Wayne Teasdale, who is the author of The Mystic Heart, and ironically, a book titled A Monk in the World. In 1999, Brian, with Brother Wayne and Barbara Fields, organized the week-long synthesis dialogues in Dharamsala, India, with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and 40 world-renowned intellectuals and spiritual leaders. This historic event was the subject of an award-winning documentary, Dalai Lama Renaissance, which featured Harrison Ford. Together with his colleague and friend, Dr. Rebecca Armstrong, Brian then co-founded the Friends of Compassion, a year-long spiritual formation program that helped fund the construction of a Tibetan elementary school in Kashmir, India, and a women's center in a remote Indian village. So the idea of writing the book, The Luminous One, which is what we're going to be discussing today, occurred during a trek that he took through the Himalayan mountains with the Tibetan monk Geshe Lobsang Yongten. Welcome, welcome, and welcome again. Pleasure
Very
to
happy
be with
to be
you.
here. Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
So to begin, we usually like to ask a question about anything in a person's childhood that they could have looked back and say, oh, I can see a little thread through my life. You were attracted to religious life as a youngster, although you did turn toward law, but you never really lost your desire to be a monk, so you say. Do
Right.
you recall any kind of early experiences that influenced your inner longing?
Well, I remember when I was about 5 years old, our family, which consisted of 8 kids and my parents, uh, took a drive through the Smoky Mountains and happened upon a Trappist monastery where the monks were supporting themselves by baking what I thought was the best bread I'd ever tasted. Uh, and these monks, although they were committed to a vow of silence, seemed to be so happy and so content and so present in themselves,
Mm,
that at that point I thought that's what I want to do is be
uh-huh,
one of those guys. Uh,
uh-huh.
but even as a child, I was pretty garrulous and uh, couldn't stop talking. And I remember my mom saying, you might want to think about another vocation. These guys, they're not allowed to talk, and that might be a problem for you. But I just loved the feeling of the place,
Mm,
and
mm,
in Catholic tradition,
mm.
big Irish Catholic families typically
Yes,
donated one of one of the male siblings to enter into the priesthood. Uh,
right, right,
yeah,
right.
I didn't really appreciate it at the time, but you got a plenary indulgence, meaning
Oh,
mom would be forgiven any misdeeds in
okay.
her entire lifetime if she gave up one of her boys
Oh
to the
boy.
priesthood. So I was nudged in that direction.
Huh.
Although actually my younger brother was the one who finally took vows, and that
Oh, I
is
see.
as a deacon.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
but
I remember actually I have some Irish in my background as well, and I'm remembering that storyline of one of the sons becomes a priest or yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I
so
didn't remember the plenary indulgence. That sounds like a good deal.
yeah, it's kind of a bit of a bribe.
I don't
uh,
think the Reformation had something to say about that, but that's a whole other topic.
right.
Thank you, thank you. I have to say that the first thing that jumped out at me when I was reading your book, The Luminous One, was the phrase that you used about, quote, reimagining Jesus.
Mhm.
And then you describe what you wrote as a work of redemptive fiction.
Mhm.
That really attracted my attention, and I would very much like to know more about what you understand the reimagining that you undertook to do in this storyline here. How do
Yeah.
you see that as redemptive?
Well, let me see if I can cover both of those kind of
Yes, yes,
questions.
wonderful.
Um, I guess part of the unstated premise of the book is that our understanding of who Jesus was, what he did, uh, what the significance of his life was. Um, Partly, we've got some historical tidbits, but I think mostly it's the product of imagination. Um, the early Jerusalem church uh, did not initially, until Paul kind of
Hmm.
pushed into it, uh,
Right.
did not essentially see him as being divine, and that his death was kind of a prearranged contract with the Trinity to absolve humanity from all of its sinfulness.
Uh-huh.
So my thought was, well, this is the story that we have. The conventional story
Hmm.
is a story that's imagined. The documentation for it is slim to none.
Hmm.
And of course, there are numerous so-called Gnostic gospels that give a different take on it. And
Right. Right.
and we have to recognize the extent to which uh, the conventional story is really the result of imaginative creation by by persons unknown to us. We don't actually know who wrote any of the Gospels. They're
Hmm.
they're attributed to the four evangelists, but uh, there's no historical connection. There's no authentication, and I guess this is where the lawyer part of me kind of comes in. It's like, what's the evidence and how reliable is it? And
Right.
is there
Right.
some reason that we should exempt the story of Jesus from our sort of Enlightenment age determination that things have to actually be true and be provable
Hmm.
or disprovable?
Hmm.
How good are the witness accounts? Because uh, obviously the Gospels were not written by people who had a direct relationship with Jesus and knew him.
Right.
Although, a lot of people still believe that these
Hmm.
are historical accounts,
Right. Right.
but anyway,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of imagination in the gospel stories we have, and since they were largely imagined as opposed to historically accurate, why not reimagine them? And
Hmm.
let's take a look at uh, what stories are really essential to our own spiritual development and understanding of who Jesus was and what he might be encouraging us to do as part of our lives.
Hmm.
Um, how can a more insightful version of that inspire us to do the hard spiritual work? In other
Hmm.
words, what Jesus do we choose to follow? Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
because there are a variety of different ones, and
Yes.
right, the
Yes.
sort
Right.
of
Right.
apocalyptic Jesus, and who's going to rain hell down on the unbelievers and so forth,
Hmm.
and then the peacemaking Jesus who says, "Turn your cheek if you're slapped." So sorting all those different Jesuses out, it's like what part of it is essential, sort of metaphysically or supernaturally, if any,
Hmm.
and what is the truth about Jesus as best we can determine for our own spiritual development.
Hmm. Hmm.
Brian,
Thank you.
I really am enjoying your book. I have about 30 pages to go. So, yeah, I have a few questions as I was reading and just listening to you now. I'm wondering though if it might be a good idea for our listeners. Your book takes us through how you imagine Jesus's missing years might have occurred. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if maybe just to set the stage for our listeners who have not read your book yet, maybe if you can kind of give us an overview of what events occurred as you have imagined them for Jesus during those missing years.
Right. So in the book, I imagine a Jesus who, after his appearance, well, first of all, to talk about the missing years, uh, in any of the Gospels, the last mention of Jesus after the story of his birth and so forth was at age 12. He was in the Jerusalem temple and kind of impressing the elders there with his profound understanding of
Hmm.
the Torah. Uh,
Hmm.
and then there's nothing about his personal life, no stories in any of the four Gospels um, until age 30. And he sort of appears at the wedding in Cana and starts doing miracles and that kind of thing. So there's an 18-year gap in there between age 12 and age 30. So I use that as the place to kind of reimagine Jesus and what he went through. And one thing that we know about legends and historical stories, whether it's about uh, Alexander the Great or the founders of Rome, any of these kinds of stories, is that there's something to it, just not the literal truth. In ancient writings, uh, providing an accurate historical biography of a great person, getting the facts straight was never really an objective. They wanted to uh, proclaim the brilliance, the power, the success of whoever it is fits in their historical account. But getting the facts right was never part of that, except for a few ancient historians who did try to get the facts right. But for the most part, ancient literature is not, they didn't consider factual truth to be necessary. So in that 18-year gap, I tried to tell some stories that later became stories in the Bible of supernatural accomplishment to suggest that there might have been a historical basis for some of those. So, for example, in the story, at age 13, Yeshua, his Aramaic name, runs away from his stepfather. So traditionally, we've considered Joseph, the husband of Mary, to be a great guy who just was kind of selflessly uh, taking care of young Jesus and teaching him how to be a carpenter. But if we told a different story, um, what would send a 12 or 13-year-old kid uh, into a quest for the divine? What would inspire that? And one thing that I think we've seen historically is that many great historical figures uh, got set on their path by something bad happening at home. So in this case, we tell a story of Yeshua's stepfather being the leader of a caravan who's he's got a heart of stone, and he's abusive and kind of a drunk. And so Jesus came in this story, from a broken home with an abusive stepfather, which is not unusual in the world. And we kind of understand how that happened. But at one point, so Jesus or Yeshua was working for his stepfather, who ran caravans between Jerusalem and Israel, all the way to India. But on the way, and his stepfather treats him very badly. He doesn't get any breaks as one of the camel boys. But there's a terrible accident, and one of the other camel boys suffers a broken leg. And his stepfather said, "Well, just leave him here. The animals will take care of him." But Yeshua was not going to let that happen. And so he carries this injured little slave boy on his back for 100 miles, and uh, and does so in a remarkable way, ends up saving the kid's life. Um, and so a story like that, where he's done something really extraordinary by any measure, then becomes the miracle of commanding someone to walk who was lame. So we give throughout the book these vignettes, these stories that would explain how we got the gospel narratives that we got. In any event, so as a 13-year-old, he ends up in Afghanistan on one of these long treks, where he's treated badly by his stepfather and decides to run away from home. And as a runaway, he ends up connecting with some Hindu pilgrims on their way to the Ganges River. So he ends up going there, and he sees this massive historical event called the Kumbh Mela, with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of pilgrims gathered by the Ganges River in acts of incredible devotion. A powerful example of baptism in a way. But the thing he noticed is that they completely ignore the Dalits, the untouchables, who are starving. And he decides he's going to help feed some of these people. And he goes around and he collects food that's kind of throwaway or unneeded by other pilgrims, starts feeding the poor and the untouchables. And this becomes quite a responsibility for him, and it ends up having a huge impact on some of the monastic groups that are there for the big religious event. So he goes through a series of experiences like that, where he enters into or witnesses various religious teachings, examples, things that he thinks should be changed. For example, uh, he really wants these Indian monks to show compassion for those who need it. And you begin to see how, in a young boy, a commitment to caring for others, feeding the hungry, uh, begins to take root. And he ends up getting some tutelage from an elderly monk who sends him to a big interreligious event in the Himalayas in Kashmir, where he's exposed to different religious beliefs. And you have to imagine that at that time, basically, Israel was a very orthodox, dogmatic religious community. There'd be very little exposure, if any, to other religious beliefs. Uh, and so when Yeshua comes back to his roots in Israel, it's a culture collision. He's got all this learning that he acquired, and he's uh, shocking and scandalous as far as the religious authorities of the time. If we compare it to, say, ISIS today, that's probably the kind of level of homogeneity that religious leaders were seeking to impose.
Well, and it's not
So,
unimaginable that he would have traveled to the east. There was a very active trade route
right,
from the Middle East to the Far East at
right,
that time. And if he was in the trades, it's not hard to imagine that he would find himself on a caravan. And I know that there has been some, I don't know if it's speculation or evidence or, some belief that he did go to the east. And a lot of his teachings do seem to have sort of an Eastern flair to them, I guess.
right,
What I find fascinating about the Jesus you write about is he takes personal responsibility for his spiritual development, where so many believe he was born divine, all-knowing, but this Jesus wasn't. He was curious, he was compassionate, he went against the grain as far as, saving the slave boy and
right.
feeding the untouchables and whatnot. But he actually took action to learn his and develop spiritually.
Right. Yeah, and I tried to write a Jesus that we could actually relate to. What I call the Jesus problem is that in conventional Christianity, as you said, we're kind of expected to treat him as an all-knowing divine figure who just somehow drops from the clouds. Uh,
Hmm.
Unlike every other human being who was ever born,
Right,
he didn't
right.
have to go through a growth process, you know.
Hmm.
But that every spiritual savant, every great spiritual leader has gone through what Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey,
Hmm.
where you're confronted with challenges and you need to overcome them, and that's how you develop that vibrant inner life. And
Hmm.
there's no reason to think he'd be any different. And also, there's no explanation for how he got to be who he was
Hmm.
developmentally. So,
Hmm. Um, so you have him in conversation with some other belief systems that were amazing to him, like Hinduism and Taoism and Buddhism, and the people who were spiritual leaders that he got to hang out with and learn from. And so he sort of carries also a lot of those understandings with him, internalizes them, and also critiques them at
right,
the same time. Um, it's a very different Jesus, of course, as you were just saying, than any of us had ever imagined before. As he goes on his journey, Joshua matures, as you just said, and he develops a strong mystic orientation, if you want to call it that. He's clearly a mystic, and he has a very strong, as you gave examples, a moral response.
Right.
So there's interesting, these two paths don't necessarily always meet happily
Hmm.
in the spiritual journey process. But what does it reveal to us about Yahshua, that he was pretty insistent on the kind of moral imperative, at least for himself, of his own response to certain circumstances,
Yeah.
as you just described a couple. And he has this very strong process of a mystic uh, uh, understanding of the nature of reality and his connection with everything. I would love it if you could just say a few words about Yahshua the mystic and Yahshua the moral leader.
Well, I have to bring up my friend brother Wayne Teasdale, who
Hmm.
was a Catholic monk, and as you said, wrote The Mystic Heart.
Right.
And one of the things that Wayne taught me was that the foundation of the mystic's life and the mystic's journey, the foundation for that is one's moral actualization. In other
Hmm.
words, mystics who don't have their roots in compassion for others, doing the right thing, uh, who have not adopted a strong moral code, those mystics, because there are plenty of them, uh,
Yeah.
go astray. They become the cult leaders uh, who are enraptured by their own insight, whatever it may be. Uh, they're so mystics who don't have a strong moral basis uh, are not to be trusted,
Mm.
basically. So Wayne was always pushing for the application of real world ethics on those who would follow the mystic path. And the
Hmm.
mystic path basically means the cultivation of one's inner life, uh,
Hmm.
so as to first of all help us lead lives of moral care and concern for others, uh,
Hmm.
but also to help us along our own path. And for the mystic, that path is union with the divine in one way or another.
Hmm.
So we have to figure out what it means to be in pursuit of the divine. What is that actually about?
Exactly. 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 Exactly.
Because we've been subject to Cartesian dualism for so long,
Yes.
where
Yes.
there's this idea of the spirit as being a separate entity,
Right.
as opposed to just simply being who we are.
Right. Certainly within many Christian churches historically, they've been very much into acts of charity and giving and supportive and so forth. But I would suggest that there is not the embrace within the institution for the 2,000 years or so um, that has based itself on its understanding of Yahshua. Um, to be as radical as he was. So there's a difference, I would say, between charity and justice.
Mm,
And my sense of Yahshua was more uh, justice oriented uh,
mhm,
and and sort of mostly charity, sort of the teach you how to fish or give you a fish thing. Um, and
mhm,
so um, and so he did some pretty radical things. And then curiously today, as it turns out, uh, in the Christian church is a reading of the story of the Samaritan woman, and as as noted, it is I've been told anyway longest single conversation recorded in the scriptures of Yahshua having a conversation with anybody, And it turns out there was this Samaritan woman who he wasn't even supposed to be talking to. So I guess I'm kind of pushing a little bit around um, his moral imperative um, is quite pushing back the boundaries on almost every notion that we embrace and still embrace.
Right.
Race, class, gender, orientation, all these things. We all haven't really done a good job in following that model. Um, yeah. So seeing that connection with, moral is a moral imperative of how you live your life in relation to that connection with personal connection with divine source. Uh, I would say has has not been terribly well embraced by all of us who may uh, refer to ourselves in that kind of orient religious grouping or spiritual process.
Yeah. Well, and I think everybody could agree that he was a boundary pusher.
Mm,
He challenged us, and this is the common ground that is so, to me, so important about
mhm,
Christianity is what are we called to do? How are we called to be? What are the boundaries that we're expected to break down? Uh, and
yeah.
and that kind of sort of radical Christianity does
Mhm,
not require really anything of the supernatural. We don't do those things, uh, because they're essential to connecting with the divine. Uh, we do those things because it's the right thing to do, and it changes who we are. And
mhm,
in that sense, he's the exemplar of that.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
his conversation that otherwise would be very scandalous with the
Absolutely.
Samaritan woman um,
Right.
shows that that's the way he was talking about. It doesn't matter whether the food's kosher or not. What matters is are people well fed, uh,
Mhm.
uh, and and that's a Jesus I think everybody can honor.
Yeah, it's pretty radical.
Yeah, and this is why, for me, just knowing the history of how, and the customs of his time and place, make his actions and words even more powerful. Like speaking with the Samaritan woman, which in that era and in his culture, you didn't speak to women, let alone a Samaritan woman who there was this whole thing where, the Samaritans were sort of ostracized or, this real hatred between the two peoples. And he spoke to her anyway. And that the same with the woman who touched his hem and was
Mhm.
healed of her bleeding. She for 12 years was ostracized because of her bleeding. That was a time when women were, you had to, during that time period in your month, you couldn't go out in public and you couldn't, you just sort of were alone during that time period, unclean. And so
Mhm.
she had experienced that for 12 years where she had lost her community, she couldn't go out in public, but she came out and she touched him, and he, instead of, turning around and saying, why did you touch me, and ostracizing, berating her for doing that, he calls her daughter.
Mhm.
He calls her daughter. Your faith has healed you. So he has sort of welcomed her back in to
Right.
community. I mean, this was radical, unheard of, just shocking, that this would happen. And so he included women as equals in his, and you reimagine that in your storytelling as well, where he questions, why can't women also find the truth?
Mhm.
Become enlightened. They're half of humanity, and he's sort of, I think he's speaking with a monk or or someone about that, who wants him to join a monastery and go with them. But he doesn't want to do that. So I'd like you to sort of take us into that Jesus, who actually does include women in as equals spiritually. And, and then we can also go into, there's the whole thing with Mary Magdalene and how she's portrayed, as someone, a fallen woman, when in actuality, maybe she was also an apostle, and yeah, maybe if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Well, ever since Godspell and we've seen Mary Magdalene as a love interest, and in this story, not a lot is made of it, but I imagine her as someone who's actually suffered in her own background and is looking for her own path to the divine, and finds a connection with him that is totally transformative for her. But it's a partnership. She's not relegated to status as a second-class citizen, but welcomed as someone who is on the same level as he is. And then then later on, the story evolves that she actually had been involved with Jesus's or Yeshua's brother, and the competition between siblings for her attention ends up resulting in basically Yeshua taking the rap for his wayward brother, or his revolutionary brother, who's actually a member of the Jewish resistance to Rome, Sakari. And so he actually ends up dying for his brother. So when we talk about redemption in the story, it makes it a much more human kind of thing rather than this cosmic bargain. Because that's how we are as human beings. We're petty, and we're jealous, and we're territorial, and all those things. And it doesn't have to be a cosmic plan to redeem humanity. It's just human beings finding the best way to be in this very challenging world that we've got. But it was the intention, and I hope it came through, that he regarded women as being his equal and their equal in terms of their own spirituality, and that their connection. You don't have to go off into the mountains to have a spiritual life. It can come from our relationship with one another on an everyday basis. That's where the rubber meets the road. And
In his travels, also, you have him meeting all these spiritual leaders from these other traditions. You also have him spending time in a deep spiritual awareness with leaders, women who are from the Greek goddess tradition. And that, I have to say, is virtually never included in any inter-spiritual or inter-mystical conversation. There's certainly, you're going to hear, even today, you're going to be hearing, about Hinduism and Taoism and Buddhism and influence of the East on the West and on back and forth. But you'll have a long way to go before you hear anything about the goddess tradition and the foundation of that supported all these others in our imaginings and what that might be like. That's a whole other interesting aspect to your story, as well as the centrality of women, as we were just speaking about, in terms of relationship.
Yeah. Well, when you imagine what the sort of Greco-Roman world was like in the first century, you know, the goddess worship was huge,
Hmm.
and you know, in India at the time, there are so many traditions of the mother goddess. Uh,
Right.
uh, and so these things had to have been very active in the world around him. And
Hmm.
the introduction of all that into very staid Jewish culture was revolutionary.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have so many mistakes to correct in our theology, you know. It's just a lifetime of work to say, no, that's he would never have done that or said that. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
but two things. One is we need to engage our own imaginations on these things and give ourselves permission for that, to contemplate what what it would have been like to be around someone who was as charismatic and
Mm.
motivational and radical as he was. So
Right.
it's okay to rely on our imaginations.
Mm.
That is our strongest spiritual power, really,
Mm. Mm.
as Rod Serling pointed out in the Twilight Zone. He said, the realm of
That goes back a
imagination.
few years.
You know,
Yeah.
the fifth dimension is the realm
Yeah.
of imagination, and that's where
Yeah.
time and space are suspended, really.
Right. Right.
Um, so getting empowering our own imagination, because that is how we cultivate our inner spiritual life.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, if someone is at a retreat, they're going to be spending a lot of time imagining what it's like to connect, say,
Mhm.
to the divine, what it's like to have a, as they say, a personal relationship with Jesus. That all happens in the realm of imagination. So
Uh-huh.
that's one critical point, and the other is truth. We need to, as much as possible, subject all of our beliefs to the question, yes, but is it true?
Mhm.
It matters whether something is true or not, and if we are arguing for the truth of a belief, of a statement, of a teaching, it should be subject to questioning, just like any other assertion. So imagination and to the extent we can, following the truth, I think are two important pieces here.
Well, I'm wondering about literal truth and
Oh,
metaphorical truth.
yeah,
And I think we get into a bit of a conundrum here. If, depending on which avenue we decide to follow the truth, how we interpret that.
yeah. Well, that's where things can get a little dangerous, because uh, human beings are very accustomed to declaring things as being absolutely true, and they're, you know, that's a reach at best and probably invalid. Um, so, the literalization of spiritual truths is where I think we get into trouble.
Right,
When
right.
people say, well, it's literally true that, that, for example, Jesus dedicated his death to the salvation of humanity, and somehow that, well, I think the teaching we can all accept is uh, living in service to others and care for others uh, is always, should always be part of our spiritual path. But when we literalize things and say, well, God was telling me that I needed to do X, Y, and Z, we need to be super careful of that, uh, because literalization, I think, is what has deprived the modern church of a lot of legitimacy.
Hmm.
One of the radical things of his ministry was that it was for everyone. He did cross all those boundaries. You know, you didn't have to, and he broke rules on the Sabbath, whatnot, because of what you just stated, to show compassion to everyone and do what is right. Going back to connecting with the divine, I wanted to just sort of touch on that. You referenced the Hindu expression, you are that.
Mhm.
Yet also at the same time, you know, recognizing you are not that. And I'm wondering if you can sort of delve a little deeper into that expression and how it relates to Jesus's teachings.
Yeah. So what I understand of mysticism is this, that human beings develop an understanding through language and through conceptualization. So if we have a thought, for example, that we have a divine nature, for example, if we have a thought about that, there's a limit to our ability to understand it at a more profound, non-conceptual basis. We're our 3D human mechanism has very real limits, and a mystic tries to find a way to talk about and think about that which is beyond our ability to have a concept of it. They look for a way to do that, and part of the way they do that is by this dialectical process in which they make an assertion. For example, God is everywhere. And then they have to immediately correct it by saying, well, he's not exactly here, but it's like that. So the books on how to sort of achieve that kind of understanding, there's a book called The Mystical Language of Unsaying. I think theologians would basically agree that God is beyond our ability to have a concept of him. God is not an object.
Right, right.
But for example, if you say, well, if God's not an object, then God is subjective. And how do I communicate about that? And how do I even grasp that God is pure subjectivity, and not an object about which anything can be said? So you find yourself, like with Zen koans, that it's the paradox of things being true and untrue at the same time.
At the same time. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the mystic's trying to get, thread that needle to get experientially an understanding, but a non-conceptual understanding. And that's a tricky process because our minds insist that we have a conceptual understanding of the world because that's how we navigate it.
Yeah.
But the mystic is kind of beyond that, and looking for ways to have the direct experience of the cloud of unknowing, but without relying on conceptualization of it. So it's, I mean, as a observer of this process, it's a very interesting dialectic that people go through in order to get that aha kind of realization.
Yeah, and aren't we always in that cloud, the observer and the observed? Even just saying to connect with the divine in a way separates oneself from the divine, which is impossible.
Right.
So
Yeah, well, that's why I think it's in the Tao Te Ching that they say um, uh, that which you can say is never the truth. The Tao is beyond what can be said about the Tao. So those who say they understand the Tao are lying because it's always moving and it can never be captured. Uh, by and it's very frustrating. But I think this is what seekers of all kinds go through this process of how can I get my mind to not do flip-flops as I get closer to the truth.
Is it possible too that some of our struggles with that has to do with the uh, structure or state of consciousness that we function from, that we think in dualistic terms?
Right.
So if I say to you, it's this, then my head is immediately saying, well, then what about the other side? Uh, um, and it's hard for us uh, to go into the sort of the alchemy of it, if you will, or that liminal space where it's not only possible that it's both, but it, it is both. And it has to be both and neither and all simultaneously. And I think that it refers to a different kind of consciousness, that maybe that's part of what people who connect with their mystic self, radiation or resonance, um, can experience that, but then you try to get it into words and it gets all blah, blah, blah.
Right.
For example, in your story of imagining, um, you refer to Yeshua speaking about God his Father. Now, in recent decades, a lot of us have had trouble with that kind of language for all kinds of reasons. And then there's translations from Aramaic that say, from pretty recognizable scholars saying, well, Father really is not the correct kind of translation of that into English anyway. It's really a much more inclusive and open-ended and if we might say mother, father, but that doesn't really work for us either. Um, so we're kind of just stuck into this not having the language yet, at least, to try to express even something basic like that.
Right.
Um, so Jesus was a mystic. And so we grapple with not only um, his perception of reality and his connection to all that is, but then he goes and lives it out in radical ways. And I think that, you know, I'm not sure that we've really scratched the surface on much of this
Right.
in all this time.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say about the amount of time that has passed um, uh, is that uh, his death, however it occurred,
Mhm,
whatever its meaning, was an absolutely horrible experience
mhm.
for his
Yes,
family and friends, and for all those who've called themselves Christians over time. Um, and and that gets back to a question I hadn't answered before, which is about redeeming Jesus.
yes, yes, yes.
Uh, that to me, we have an ungrieved foundational death,
Uh-huh.
and that Christianity has found a way to avoid grieving that death by sanctifying it.
Hmm.
And as if he were somebody that we actually knew, somebody had been part of our community, and we grew up with him, and he was an
Right.
extraordinary. His death would have been completely shattering. We
Yeah.
wouldn't have glorified it. So I think one of the things that Christianity as an institution has yet to accomplish is by grieving that death, because what we know about human beings is repressed grief leads to dysfunction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How the grieving process asks of us that we come forward and share our sense of loss, uh,
Yeah.
so that we can come to terms with it. And I would love to see a, a, uh, an experience in Christianity of honoring that death, and instead of crosses, which represent cruelty, really, uh, there'd be a more loving description or symbol of
Uh-huh.
his life. It's something that was
But
positive.
it's not only crosses, it's crucifixes
Yeah.
Yeah,
as
crucifix.
well as, you know, um, that's a very interesting idea and a notion. And I'm wondering too, comes to my mind, um, in terms of today, all the grieving that we are not doing. Um,
Mhm.
Even if you could, even just looking at the last week of
Yeah.
in the United States, for example, which impacts, the whole world, what's happening. Um, the whole being able to be in touch with all of that loss, all of the loss of all of the species that have been destroyed, all of the
Yes.
loss of clean air and clean water, um, and the loss of someone like well, even as your story has it, Yahshua, accepts the verdict of, he accepts that he's going to take the rap, as you said earlier, um, in that scenario as you play it out in your imagination, and does that willingly. And I say that is um, still part of the Christian story, is that he willingly went to his death,
Right.
and that um, there are people who do that. Not a lot of us, maybe, but there are people who do that. Um, and uh, again, holding that up uh, as a moral imperative. People who we can think of Martin Luther King
Right.
as an example, many others, I suppose. But um, when you bang up against the powers that be, those people who do that end up dead.
Yeah. Yeah. That is a repeated pattern.
Yes.
And it's the power of institutions which have gone from sort of collective religious um, dogma through the process of, well, we'll build an institution to convey this teaching
Right.
to where we are now, which is we will digitize the entire experience
Yeah.
uh, through AI. Uh, that the forces of the mechanical, the unconscious, are extremely strong,
Mm.
and it seems to me getting stronger. And the idea of standing up against that, uh, not justifying it, it seems to me is what we're all called to do.
Mm.
Uh,
Mm.
that that it is now to us to preserve humanity,
Mm.
because the human connection, the overcoming our self-centeredness, uh, which is destroying the planet and leading to war.
Mhm.
I mean, the justifications of for that are basically a, a destruct. It destroys our sense of ourselves as human beings.
Mhm.
Mm.
So humanity uh, is really in danger right now. It seems to me.
Yes. Absolutely.
Uh,
Yeah, it's a real separation from the divine. and separating others, other beings, other people from sacredness, really.
Yeah.
And part of being human is our connection to the divine, is our divinity,
Yeah.
and recognizing that in all life, in others, which is basically the term namaste.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
the divinity in me sees the divinity in you. I appreciate that you have sort of woven those two together in your story about Jesus, his humanness, you know, his taking personal responsibility for his spiritual growth, and yet his divinity, and how that influences his actions in the world, being
Yeah.
connected to the sacred. And I think if we can get back to that as a species, things would radically change. And for some reason, we've cut off the sacredness.
Well, and I think that's such an important point, because however one would define God, it has something to do with the interconnectedness of all things, and the fact that in accordance with kenosis or shunyata, everything is connected to everything, and nothing is separated out. There's not an essence that anything has that can be defined and separated away.
Right.
And so that the sense of interconnectedness of all things as being the divine, you can see that he lived into that he refused to accept any of those false separations of,
Right.
like you were talking about with the Samaritan woman.
Right.
That's not a difference that should ever matter or ever lead us to exclude others from our embrace. Uh, and it's so clearly on the chopping block uh, with the current administration's campaign against diversity and exclusion,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? I mean, that's taking on directly saying, no, I am declaring that there are those who are undeserving, and only
Right.
those I designate are deserving. I mean,
Right.
it's just a horrible anti-humanistic movement that has somehow wormed its way into our consciousness. And
Yeah, there's a lot of othering happening, a lot
yes,
of excluding people from the circle of compassion, and you know, a lot of that happening in this country right now, by
yeah,
people who call themselves Christian even. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that,
yeah.
One of the things I'm thinking about as you're speaking is this need to save humanity, or the humanity within us. Hard
mhm,
to how you want to talk about it, but um, we there are those who believe we are ending a particular era of life on the planet and moving into the possibility of another way of being together. That's closer to what you were just describing as everything is connected to everything else and everything lives within everything else. It's based on relationality. It's based on everything is relational,
yeah,
from the photon on. And I'm thinking of the phrase that Thomas Berry used as that we need to reinvent the human.
uh,
And that is based on sort of what I think of his motto as we are a community of subjects, not a collection of objects.
oh, well, brilliant,
And we do all this together, or we don't do it at all.
right,
That sense of coming to this other recognition of our identity as relational persons is so counter to the separateness that we have all inherited. It's hard to get our head around. And that sense of what is sacred is also not over there and separate and just me and God or whatever, or me and Jesus or however, whatever language you want to use. but it is all about all of everything being profoundly connected. In order to be able to move to some other place with this understanding of who we are and on this planet, or not. We're either like we
Yeah.
are, make that, or not.
Yeah. Well, as species evolve, um,
Right.
it where they actually make the change physiologically or otherwise is at the point of extinction.
Yeah.
That's where change happens. All of a
Right.
sudden you're about to go over the waterfall and you pop out some wings and you can save yourself from it. But that what that means is, do we have to be at the level of extinction before we actually live the realization of interconnectedness? Is that what it's going to take? Because that's going to be a bumpy ride. Um, that's and it does seem, doesn't it, that
Yes.
forces seem to be conspiring to lead us to that point.
Right.
Uh, that the point of, no, we're actually not kidding. The human
Right.
experiment is not going to succeed unless we
Right.
really get this.
Right. So until we get out of denial, one could say, and also our inability to grieve, what
Yeah.
is, as you were saying earlier, um, yeah. Well, I don't think most of us like change a whole lot. So here we have this whole collective, massive collective change that has to happen, and
Yeah.
we have to be right on the edge. I know that evolutionary um, uh, cosmology talks about kind of a entropy is part of the operations of the universe, part of the laws of physics, but that there is a belief, at least in uh, uh, well, Christian and other circles, of that there is also a, a love that's a power, not a sentimental,
Hmm.
I love you thing, which is also fine, but um, there is an energy of love that goes bangs into that entropy, or that part of us that doesn't want to do anything, that's
Hmm.
resistant to change. And that's the faith, I guess, or the moral courage, perhaps, to get back to Yahshua, of believing in that transformative possibility.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of Teilhard de Chardin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
They're moving toward the Omega.
Yeah.
Wha- Yeah, these are big stakes though, aren't they? I mean,
That's right.
I mean, if somebody came up and said, "Oh, you're responsible for saving humanity," and the fact is, you are. Uh, You know,
Yes, but
each of
but
us
not
is
not 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 to separate you, not to separate
right.
me. All us together are, yeah,
Yeah,
It does seem like we're being forced to evolve,
yeah,
you
and that
know?
seems to be the only way it happens.
Yeah,
Is
that's the
yeah.
only way.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. That's encouraging, actually. But we have evidence to say this has happened before under great enormous pressure.
right.
Something new can happen. And Teilhard, believes is, that there is this counterforce, if you will, that's going to
Mm.
press and push us to the point of making a decision. Because unlike fish, perhaps, um, we have a certain level of choice,
Hmm.
which
Right.
only complicates things, of course.
We
Yeah.
have to take personal responsibility, I think.
Yeah,
Not just
yeah,
individually, but collectively. So
yeah.
You know, there's a term called Christ consciousness,
Yes.
and 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 maybe that's what the second coming is actually all about.
Uh-huh.
Is on a mass basis, people actually becoming aware of our connection to one another and the pure folly of excluding others. That
Yes.
if that arises, that is is sharing that Christ consciousness with all of humanity.
Mm.
Exactly.
And maybe that is what is being called for. I know Brother Wayne, to refer again to a real mystic. There was at the Parliament of the World's Religions, there was a sort of an elite collection of about 20 or 30 Christian and Buddhist monks with the Dalai Lama and Masao Abe from the Zen tradition and some others. And Wayne gave a beautiful talk of about the Tibetan people being the sacrificial Jesus of our time. Uh, that
Mm.
that standing up for, I mean, there's no way Tibet could ever challenge China's power,
Right.
but standing up for that in all the ways that manifests, and see the suffering Jesus in all those around us is
Yeah.
part of the work of redemption.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
uh, and speaking of redemption, what I meant about redeeming Jesus is that I feel like he's been kind of hijacked uh, by the institution, and it's
Mhm.
time for us to reclaim him.
Yeah.
That's the work of redemption, is bringing our exemplar back from his from the hijack that occurred in maybe the fourth century or earlier.
Yeah.
A friend of mine named Michael Now once said, we were talking about this, and he was a Jewish entertainer, and he said, Jesus is Elvis, everybody else is just a concessionaire. Riding on his coattails. But the real thing
Right.
is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
You
Right.
know, the courage
Right.
to face down the highly militarized and often extremely cruel regime
Yes.
of Rome, facing that
Mhm.
down with pure, unadulterated acceptance, love, and forgiveness.
Yeah.
It's
That's
To
very
quite.
threatening, was very threatening.
Yeah,
And, I mean, it kind of seems like it's in a way happening again, a repeat of history
yeah.
in many ways.
Yeah, well, we're seeing it expressed in the baldest possible terms. Like,
Mhm.
this is all about power. This has nothing to do with what's right or even legal. Uh,
Mhm.
this is about the pure exercise of power.
Right.
I'm doing it because I can,
Mhm.
Right.
and
And all
that,
based on fear. Underneath all of that,
Yeah,
based on fear.
yeah, it's all fear-based.
Fear of not being in control. Fear.
yeah.
Fear. Yeah.
Well, they say we have a choice between love and fear, and
That's it. We have a choice. That's a good thing. It's a good thing we have a choice.
we do have a choice, and the burden is to make that choice and take
Right.
that risk.
Right.
Uh, but we've got
Thank you.
a good example to follow.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. This has been wonderful conversation. We've really enjoyed speaking with you and sharing all these great mysteries. I wonder if you've had an opportunity to have a quote nearby that you like, that sometimes we like
I do.
to close our conversation with a favorite quote from our guest uh, that we can share with everyone.
I do have one from Leonardo da Vinci. It is this: uh,
Yes,
the noblest pleasure is the joy of understanding.
Mhm.
Leonardo.
Leonardo, yeah,
Leonardo.
because
Thank you.
that was his mission, to understand it. Well, he wanted to understand everything, and he got pretty far along.
But we all.
Thank you so much, Brian. This has been a
It's
pleasure.
been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Absolute pleasure.
It's been great.
Absolute pleasure.
And namaste to you both.
Namaste. Namaste. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
thanks.
you.
To find out more about Brian Muldoon and his book, The Luminous One, please visit theluminousonebook.com.